alive a and still alive a Holocaust girlhood remembered. Ruth Kluger describes how, as a child, she learned she was no longer welcome in Vienna, the place that had been her only home. Banned from the swimming pool, the movie theater, and the skating ring, forbidden to own a bicycle or enter a certain shops. Out of school and eventually into a ghetto and a series of camps. As Kluger tartly explained, she was given an early opportunity to practice critical discrimination. It is, of course, painful to experience prejudice, but oppression also forces its victims to learn who they are. This session considers this coming of self awareness in 3 Holocaust memoirs. To lead us in this discussion in this different perspective of the Holocaust, we are joined by Dr. Dorian Stuber, who is professor of English at Hendrix College. His writings on Holocaust-related topics include the edited volume Critical Insights, Holocaust Literature, and an essay in the Oxford American on teaching the Holocaust as a Canadian living in the South. As a board member of the Arkansas Holocaust Education Committee, he regularly leads teacher training sessions and regularly teaches at the Holocaust Museum, at the Holocaust Museum's Belfer National Conference for Educators and the museum's fellowship program, where I have had the pleasure to attend 2 of his sessions. Without further ado, Dr. Dorian Stuber.
Thank you, Lisette. I appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Adara Goldberg. Thanks to everyone at Kean who is helping to make this possible. Thanks to all of you for being here. Maybe you had to be here. I don't know if you're in a class, but I appreciate it nonetheless. So as Lisette was saying, here's what I want to do today. I want to show you how you could use literature in particular to explore how minorities must often come to self-understanding through the values and beliefs of a majority that is hostile to them, okay? So why is this important? 2 reasons. One, it will help your students to understand one aspect of the persecution that comprised the Holocaust. And also that might help them to make links between that historical event and other events that might be closer to home for them. I'll say more about that later. So that's one thing. Second thing is to show you how you, by using specific details gleaned from the close reading of short sections of text, you can help students to come to really significant conclusions. So by close reading, what I mean is reading that pays attention to how form shapes content, right? Like the how we say something affects what we say, right? So this is when we read from a kind of literary perspective or a rhetorical perspective, like we're not just treating language as kind of like a vehicle or machine for delivering content, but like the mode of expression totally shapes what we actually say, right? So if you can teach sort of students to pay attention to that, to do that kind of work of close reading, then even with like short excerpts of text, you can really get them, I think, to come to some substantive conclusions, because those conclusions are always going to be grounded in things that are actually there in the text, right? So it's a kind of mode of like what we call immanent reading, like from the bottom up, as opposed to like a top-down reading where some predetermined idea is you're supposed to make your evidence kind of fit that, which never works out. So what I'm going to do here is kind of like work through like a sample lesson plan, and that you could expand it over several class periods. You could do it in one class period. A lot depends on how long your classes are, who's in your classes, your goals, etc. Right? But I'm going to so it's going to be a kind of like combination of like I'm talking through what I do, and then I'm also going to make you do some things. So I think. I may be wrong about this, but I think that some of the people in the audience are teachers and some are students. And I think a lot of those students want to be teachers. I think this is how this is working, I think. So the conclusions that I'm going to lead us to today, hopefully, I think are reasonably sophisticated, but I am confident that they can be appreciated by your students, whether they are in middle school, in high school, or in college. And I say that even though those are widely different audiences. But I say that because I have taught a version of this thing that I'm presenting to you today at the Northwest Arkansas Holocaust Education Conference, which for 30 years, up until COVID kind of brought an end to it, was an annual event that brought like 300 middle and high school students along with their teachers together for a 1 day long conference with plenaries and breakout sessions and stuff. So I taught this to a group of middle school, high school students and teachers and some 75-year-old community members in a 55-minute session. So which was really fun and a wonderful experience that we don't get enough of as educators, I think, where we get to mix different age groups and stuff like that. But at any rate, my point here is that even though it's kind of sort of a complex kind of conclusion, I think that this can work for a lot of different age ranges and experience ranges. So there's a handout, and I hope that you guys got this handout because it's important for what's going to happen, but I have slides too in case that has gone awry for you at any rate. And so that I use the handout, of course, I used it in that session. I use it with my students, and it is headed by two different quotations that I'm also going to kind of pull up here. Let me try the dreaded screen sharing and see how that works. Okay. Yes. No, I don't want to do that. Hopefully this is going to be full screen for you guys now. Can anyone nod or give me a thumbs up? You can see this thing here. Awesome. Okay, thank you. So these two quotations that are also on the handout, and one is from Ruth Kluger, whose memoir we're going to talk a little bit about, and that Lizette was mentioning before. I had found out for myself and by myself how things stood between us and the Nazis, and had paid for knowledge with the coin of pain. This idea of learning something at a cost, right? And then second quotation from someone very different. This was from W.E.B. Du Bois. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. So at first glance, putting these two people together is kind of weird. So on the one hand, we have the Viennese-born survivor of Theresienstadt ghetto camp, of the Auschwitz killing center, of the Christianstadt labor camp and death march. On the other hand, we have the legendary sociologist, whose life spans the late 19th and then through the first half of the 20th century. But I think it's worth putting both of these people together because they both thought very deeply about how the ambivalent experience of being a member of a persecuted minority. If you're in a persecuted minority, to know is to hurt, and to exist is to be a problem. So that's kind of giving us a clue as to where this is all going to be kind of headed. And I think ultimately bringing in Du Bois's ideas is going to be really important. So the talk that I have for today, the title of the talk that I have for today, Strangers in Their Own Land, Jewish Self-Awareness in Holocaust Memoir. So this title is adapted from an anecdote in Kluger's memoir. And it comes from early in the book, and she is talking about something that happened in 1937. So it's before the war starts, before the annexation of Austria. The year before that happens, she is almost 6 years old, and her family goes on vacation in Italy. And they have a car, which is pretty unusual for the time period. And it's even more unusual for Italy, which was more impoverished. It was a poorer place than Austria. And they're in the south of Italy, which was even more impoverished. And they're driving along in the countryside, and they pass another car that has Austrian license plates. And the tourists wave to each other. And Kluger reflects back in the moment because she even at the time, she thinks that's so weird. We wouldn't have done that at home. We don't even know who those people are. Right? But then she writes in her memoir many years later, I was enchanted by the discovery that strangers in a strange land greet each other because they are compatriots. I was enchanted by the discovery that strangers in a strange land greet each other because they are compatriots. Now, this kind of sense of belonging and connectedness, that's exactly what she's going to lose, right? In a short period of time, right? So the kind of comforting nationalism, strangers become acquaintances because they call the same place home. This soon proves to be, for her and her family and her entire community, totally false and alienating, right? What Kluger learns is that, and she learns it along with the rest of the Jews of Europe, is that being Jewish suddenly mattered much more than being Austrian or being German or Polish or French or whatever. Okay, so this is a real kind of like that there's a cataclysm that happens in terms of like we thought we belonged to a place and then it turns out we didn't. I do want to just put a little parentheses here that the three people whose works I'm excerpting for today that we're looking at, they were all assimilated. They came from assimilated families. And so to clarify what that is, for Jews in particular, or any minority group like who kind of like felt their way into trying to belong to the majority or the dominant culture, right? And assimilated Jews tended to be much more secular, much less observant than religious or Orthodox Jews, right? They tended to live in Western Europe more than Eastern Europe. There were already lots of Jews in especially Eastern Europe who never felt this sense of belonging. The places that they lived never allowed them to pretend to belong. Okay, so that's a super important caveat that I just want to say. But in terms of the purposes of this exercise here, the three people we're looking at did live in countries and lived in families that practiced this assimilation, and so that's where they felt the jarring kind of quality so strongly of like all of a sudden we don't belong. So on the holiday before the war, Kluger enjoys the experience of being a stranger in a strange land. And then just a year later, after the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria, Kluger becomes a stranger in her own land. And that's a pretty shattering realization. You're not at home. Your home's not your home anymore. You thought it was your home and it's not your home. You feel loss, right? You feel unease. You feel betrayal. But perversely, and this is kind of the point here today, is you also gain something. Yeah, you gain self-awareness. And so this paradox that like there's a gain that comes along with the loss, right, is at the heart of the lesson that I'm working with you on today. So you could use any form of testimonial literature to talk about this dilemma. Like you could use excerpts from diaries, for example, right? The examples that I've chosen are they're from memoirs, and I think that memoirs are a really good form for doing this kind of work because they're by definition they're written after the fact, right? Okay, so they're like someone is reflecting on something that happened before. So that means that process of reflection is going to be foregrounded. This whole like X happened to me then, it meant Y to me, but now I think Z, right? So that kind of sense of like of change is sort of built into the form of the memoir. So that's kind of the main reason why I have selected those kinds of texts for this assignment, for this lesson. And the examples that I have are from 3 female survivors, right? So these are the ones that were on your handout, and I also have slides for them as well. And so 3 female Holocaust survivors. So there's Ruth Kluger, who I've been mentioning. She's born 1931 in Vienna, Austria, deported to various camps, escaped a death march at the end of the war. So that's 1. 2, Nechama Tek, who was born in Lublin in Poland, also in 1931. She was hidden together with her family they lived under assumed identities. So she could go out in public because she could kind of pass. She didn't quote unquote look Jewish, right? But she was living under an assumed identity, always at great risk to herself. Her parents could not leave the house that they were paying these people to hide them because they looked too Jewish. Yeah. Then finally, the third person is Sarah Kaufman, who was born in Paris in 1934 to parents who had emigrated to France from Poland. And she, Sarah Kaufman, survived in hiding together with her mother with a family friend. And she learned to call this person Mei. Okay. And just as an interesting kind of like fact, I'm not sure what to make of this, other than it partly explains why these are such a well-written text, that all 3 of these women later became academics, right? Kluger became a professor of German, and Tech became a professor of sociology, and Kaufman became a professor of philosophy. So, one thing I have here to show my students is I have, map of Europe, so I can show people the different kind of places. I like the Vienna. I don't know if when I do this, if you also see my cursor going here, Vienna, Austria, and then of course Paris over here, and like Lublin is like over here, right? So I spend a little time kind of trying to orient them. And again, that depends a lot on whether you are doing other things with the Holocaust and they already know some stuff, or this is the first time out, etc. I also will spend time with students on kind of explaining a little bit about who these people are. I'm going to skip all that stuff today, the kind of the bios of these people. I did want to kind of show you some pictures of them. Here's Nechama Tech, both young and old. Her maiden name was Bavnik. She just died last year. And so, I've got a whole bunch of information that I share with people. We're going to look at that later. Here's Ruth Kluger, the badass of all badasses, looking tough there. She died not so long ago either. Again, there's lots of things to be said about her. And here is Sarah Kaufman, whose dates were 1934 to 1994. So in class, what I would do is I would start with that kind of biographical orientation. And then I would divide the students into 3 groups. And so I think for my tech support person here that I'm going to give the kind of warning about how I think I want to do the breakout rooms, 3 different groups in a few minutes time. So and just as close to an equal number of people as we can get in each group, that would be fantastic. Okay, thanks for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. So they divide the students into 3 groups, and each one of those groups is assigned one of those 3 writers and then one passage from the memoir, and those are the ones that are on your handout. And we start by reading these passages aloud together, and I want to do that work for us now. And again, you can follow along here on the screen, or you can follow along on your handout if you have that available. So first from Nechama textbook, her memoir is called Dry Tears, The Story of a Lost Childhood, first published in 1982. And it was written in English, which I think is important. As I said, she came to, I don't know if I said that. She said she became a professor, but she became a professor in the United States, where she eventually ended up. So here's a section from early on in the text, and the context that you need to know, that your students could know, is here's a scene that happens in 1940 or 41. It's kind of unclear. And Tech, remember, she's about 9-10 years old. She is living with her family in hiding. They're living in an unused part of a factory that used to belong to Tech's father. Okay, he was an industrialist. He had this factory. They made candles and stuff there. And of course, it was taken away from him, expropriated. But he is kind of friendly with the person who is who has been tasked with running the place, and so they can kind of live in hiding in this disused part of it. And the factory is right next to a convent school, and this school is a source of fascinated longing for Nechama Tech. So here's this passage. I found a small opening in the wall from which, unobserved, I could watch the girls at play. To me, they seemed so content, so carefree, and I envied them their fun. Did they know that a war was on? At times, as I watched them, I too became engrossed in their games and almost forgot about the war. But the bell that called them back to class called me back to reality, and at such moments I became acutely aware of my loneliness. These small excursions made me feel, in the end, more miserable than ever. The girls in the boarding school were so near and yet so far. The wall that separated us was thick indeed, and eventually I could not bear to go near it. Okay, so that's passage number 1. Passage number 2 is from Ruth Kluger. It's a little bit longer, and the passage basically gives its own context, I think. But I will remind the students, and I will therefore remind you that this is from 1940, as the passage says at the beginning. And in 1940, the situation for Jews in Vienna was really dangerous. And Kluger's father, who was a doctor, had already been arrested for seeing non-Jewish patients, and he has just fled. He's fled to France. He gets to France in safety, but then he is arrested in France a year or 2 later, and he's deported to the Baltics, and where he is murdered. So the family is kind of broken up. Kluger's mother is a nurse, and she is working at this Jewish hospital, which kind of protects her. She and her daughter, Ruth Kluger, are on the last transport of Jews out of Vienna in 1942. So for right now, she's living in this precarious life in Vienna still. Her own deportation is 2 years into the future. So in 1940, when I was 8 or 9, the local movie theater showed Walt Disney's Snow White. I badly wanted to see this film, but since I was Jewish, I naturally wasn't permitted. I groused and bitched about this unfairness until finally my mother proposed that I should leave her alone and just go and forget about what was permitted and what wasn't. So, of course, I went, not only for the movie, but to prove myself. I bought the most expensive type of ticket, thinking that sitting in a loge would make me less noticeable. And thus, I ended up next to the 19-year-old baker's daughter from next door with her little siblings, enthusiastic Nazis, one and all. When the lights came on, I wanted to wait until the house had emptied out, but my enemy stood her ground and waited too. She spoke firmly and with conviction, in the manner of a member of the Bund Deutscher Mädchen, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, to which she surely belonged. Hadn't I seen the sign at the box office? I nodded. What else could I do? It was a rhetorical question. Didn't I know what it meant? I could read, couldn't I? It said, no Jews. I had broken a law. If it happened again, she would call the police. I was lucky that she was letting me off this once. The story of Snow White can be reduced to one question. Who is entitled to live in the king's palace and who is the outsider? The baker's daughter and I followed this formula. She in her own house, the magic mirror of her racial purity before her eyes, and I, also at home here, a native, but without permission and at this moment expelled and exposed. Even though I despised the law that excluded me, I still felt ashamed to have been found out. For shame doesn't arrive from the shameful action, but from discovery and exposure. Okay, so that's from Ruth Kluger. And finally, the third passage, which is from Sarah Kaufman, and from her memoir. And again, the context for this passage here is this passage here is set in 1942 or 1943, and it describes how Maymay, remember that was the woman who at a lot of risk to herself, who took in Kluger and her mother, right? Describes Maymay as both savior, but also as an abuser, okay? So this passage here, knowingly or not, Maymay had brought off a tour de force. Right under my mother's nose, she'd managed to detach me from her, and also from Judaism. She had saved us, but she was not without anti-Semitic prejudices. She taught me that I had a Jewish nose and made me feel the little bump that was the sign of it. She also said, Jewish food is bad for the health. The Jews crucified our Savior, Jesus Christ. They are all stingy and love only money. They are very intelligent. No other people has as many geniuses in music and philosophy. My mother suffered in silence. No news from my father. He had been arrested and deported. And he was murdered at Auschwitz. No means of visiting my brothers and sisters. They were in hiding in different places in the French countryside, and she had tried to hide Ruth Kluger there as well, but Ruth Kluger like cried so much, missed her mother so much, and also would not eat pork and like screamed when anyone tried to feed her anything that had pork in it. And so like, which in like it's French food, right? So like everything. And so her mother had to keep her with her in Paris, which was a dangerous place to be. Anyway, so she's suffering in silence, no news from my father, no means of visiting my brothers and sisters, no power to prevent Maymay from transforming me, detaching me from herself and from Judaism. I had, it seemed, buried the entire past. I started loving rare steak cooked in butter and parsley. I didn't think at all anymore about my father, and I couldn't pronounce a single word in Yiddish, despite the fact that I could still understand the language of my childhood perfectly. Now I even dreaded the end of the war. Yiddish, just to clarify, the language of Eastern European Jews. It's a language that has a lot of similarities to German. It is not a dialect. It is its own language. It also has a lot of loan words from Hebrew and is written in the Hebrew alphabet too. So just a heads up. Okay, so the students have got the background. They know who these people are. They know the passages, right? So then they're in their three groups. There's a Kaufman group, there's a Kluger group, there's a tech group, right? And each group is working together and they're trying to answer two questions, okay? They're discussing the passage and answering two questions. And these are on the handout. And also I have a slide here, except you're gonna go away to a breakout room in a second. So there's one question that's the same for everybody. And that question is like, what can we, like, do you see self-awareness in this passage? And if so, how? So that everybody can be talking about that. And then there is a particular question for each group that's asking people to pay attention to something specific. And again, on the handout, if you have, for tech, right? The question is to track the verbs that tech uses, okay? what can we learn about our experience when we pay attention to the verb? So if you pay it, so you can talk about anything that you want. Students can talk about anything that they want in regards to this passage, but I especially want them to think about like, look at the verbs and what does that tell us? For Kluger, the words that I really want them to pay attention to is the word home and its kind of synonyms in the passage, right? So what do we learn when we kind of zoom in and pay attention to that? And then finally, for Kaufman, the words to pay attention to are the repeated words detach and nose. And what do we learn about Kaufman's experience when we pay attention to those? So the verbs for tech, home and its cognates, its synonyms for Kluger, and detach and nose for Kaufman. So this is the point where what I want to do is send you guys off to do this work a little bit, right? So like, you know, you could spend however much time you have in terms of like your own class structure if you did this. Like if you did this over more than one period, maybe you would have them meet for 5 minutes kind of towards the end of class to start talking, and then they were going to work individually between classes and then can come back and spend some section of the next class, the whole next class. It really depends on how long they are and how much time you want to devote to this, etc. Right? Okay. But what I'm going to do for you guys, I'm going to give you guys 8 minutes. So you'll be sent somewhere to the in the Ethernet here. You'll be in the breakout room, and your task is to. I guess the only thing is I'm not sure is how to tell who's which. This is where I need Bree to help out here. So like group 1 will be tech. How about group 2 will be Kluger? And group 3 will be Kaufman. Can we do that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So does anyone, before this happens and you get sent away, what questions do you have about what I've just asked you to do? If you have questions about like, ideas and all that stuff, we're going to talk about all that at the end, but I just want to make sure there's no questions about like, wait, what are we going to do when we get in the group? You have 2 questions to answer, right? One the same for everybody, one specific to each group. And then we're going to talk together collectively when we return. Is that good? Excellent. Okay. All right. I wish you a fruitful conversation. Should be lots of fun, and I'm looking forward to talking with you collectively when we get back.
All right, everyone should have received their invitation. You should just need to accept it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to stop share here for right now. Looking at the time, okay.
And then I can see if you need like the groups of each, like the people in each room.
All I need is for people then to collectively come back. So
Yeah, at
either,
any point I can like recall them back.
yeah,
To
if
have
we
them.
can recall them at about like, I don't know, 11 after or something now, something like that, 4:11, does that work?
Mhm.
Okay. Or I guess it's 5:11 for you all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Lizette, remind me, we have until 6 your time, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, that's good. That's what I wanted to hear. Right.
There's just one participant that's not in a room.
Okay.
So, but I
Um,
can put them in the room. It's just that they haven't accepted it yet.
right. Well, I guess I'm just going to assume that there was a reason that they didn't accept, like maybe they have
Mhm.
something else pressing or whatever. So I think we could just leave them here, unless this person wants to speak up and and say if they would like to go to a room, in which case you could just send them to. I'm
And then,
guessing they're away. I'm guessing they're away from their computer or something. That's my hunch.
yeah, probably. And then also, if either of you two want to go to a room, I can also assign you to a room to if you want to check in or anything like that.
I appreciate it. I find it's inhibiting if I do that. So,
Yeah.
I'm so, but please, I should feel free if you want to do that.
You can send me into one.
Okay,
Thank you.
no
Send them
problem.
straight. Make sure they're doing their job.
I'll send you to the room that has only 3 people in it.
Okay,
That's one.
that's smart.
Thanks.
That's thank
No
you.
problem. Okay. Mm. Would you like me to recall them back now?
That would be great. Thank you.
No problem. And it'll give them like, I think like 30 seconds to like wrap up. So
Sure. Sounds good. All right, folks should be back, I think, connecting. Thanks for indulging me in that. I hope that was interesting. And I'm looking forward to hearing, oh, cat, dog, even better. I'm looking forward to hearing the results of your no doubt fruitful conversations. So let's start with the Nechama Tech folks. And of course, anyone can chime in here, but we'll start with the group members themselves. You know, just unmute yourself and say something. No need to raise hands or anything like that. So we could start with the self-awareness question. To what extent did you see self-awareness in that passage of Nechama Tech's, and if so, how so?
Is this group one?
That's group one. Yep.
Yeah, we're in big trouble because we were regaled with Dr. Borden in our group and we got completely off topic and we're listening to his story. So we didn't actually get to either of the questions. I'm sorry.
There's always a problem group. This is like real life pedagogy here. Okay, yeah.
So-
Well, like we've all had a chance to look at the passage, right? So I read it to you again a minute ago. Like to what extent, and I can open this up for anybody here then, like to what extent does tech demonstrate self-awareness here in this passage? And how can we tell?
I'm sorry, I'm rereading now. The before I was even digesting the words, I just was reminded of the movie that I saw a couple weeks ago. The name is, what is that movie? There's a movie just won like awards.
Oh,
The zone of interest.
What is it?
The zone of interest.
Yes. Okay. So that's all I thought about when I read this. That reminded me of that.
Yeah.
So I feel that the author is self-aware because she's able to wonder about the self-awareness of the people. You know, I'm thinking on the other side of the wall.
Yep.
I'll have a knock at my door. I'll be right back. Joy, take it away.
And sure. I found, as soon as I read that, I found it very relatable. I felt that the author was self-aware in recognizing the commonness of the activity she was observing, yet also able to see that she didn't, but like she saw kind of like the juxtaposition of belonging and not belonging in this very basic act that she was watching, this very basic activity. And then it brought me to some recent paintings that I've seen of students with immigration. And very similarly, watching on the other side of the fence of the playground and being separate from a group of children because of their difference culturally. And I thought, wow, you know, this is something that while the author's self-aware, there's also an awareness that I think many children have experienced that. So it's something that a lot of students of all ages could connect with, whether it's religion, race, culture, or just I don't belong. I feel different. So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
just saw so much opportunity there to work with that passage.
Great. I appreciate that. That's one of the reasons I like to use the passage a lot, because it does resonate strongly with students because of that kind of, there's the specificity of the moment, as you say, but there's also kind of like a lot of connections to more general senses of exclusion, right? So I think Liz and Joy have really said some useful and important things here. I was really struck, Liz, by your comment about how like she demonstrates self-awareness by thinking about others' lack of self-awareness, right? I mean, like, what are they doing over there? Don't they know what's going on? How can they be playing? Don't they know there's a war going on? Like, so there's that, so it's like, it isn't even initially self-directed. Ultimately, that's where it kind of lands. It makes her feel a certain way, but it's through thinking about the other, right? I think that is really well put. And I wanted to add something to what Joy you were saying, was reminding me or making me think about the position that Tech begins this passage in is as a kind of voyeur, right? She can see the others don't know that they're being observed, right? And so classic kind of voyeur situation in which, like, we often think of as kind of as offering a certain kind of like power imbalance or whatever, right? Like there's a person who is doing something and other people don't know, right? But in this case, like that person who has that kind of ability is ultimately sort of disempowered, right? So there's a weird kind of, does that make sense? There's that kind of like that paradox there, right? Want to ask specifically to all of you about the verbs. I find this a useful kind of question. So like, I'll just mention them here. Like, so talk to me about these verbs. I found a small opening. I could watch the girls at play. I envied them their fun. Then I became acutely aware, made me feel I could not bear. So if we think about those verbs, what kinds of conclusions might we come to here about X experience? This is for anybody, and I just encourage you to kind of like jump in and yeah, it's nice you put a hand up. You don't even have to. Yeah. Just unmute and let us hear.
Sorry. Well, I think this is a nice, this passage is a good juxtaposition to the last one, which is what my group was talking about, because this one, if you trace the verbiage, it is finding something through that experience that is I'm so sorry, my dogs are right next to me.
It's okay.
But finding that experience externally and then drawing a conclusion internally about the emotional, and that's really where the self-awareness comes in, because we all have external experiences, but are we cognitively aware of how it's affecting us mentally? And she is, because she immediately needs to separate herself from their reality as opposed to her own reality, and can't expose herself to that experience anymore because it is too harmful to her.
Too harmful, right? It's too painful. Yeah. Which is also another version of kind of that self-awareness. So I think that's super nicely put, Angela. I really appreciate that. Like the movement there from it's weird to me because on the one hand, those first three verbs I mentioned, those are like active verbs. Those are verbs. Those are things she's doing, right? Like the move in the passage is from action to reflection or to feeling, right? And so things she's doing. Just a little timer to keep myself a little on track here. Like watching. I found a small opening, like this is her doing something here, right? Okay, so students will often kind of like gravitate to that sort of sense of like her taking charge here. And yet, paradoxically, the result of all those active doing, finding, watching, envying is, as you're suggesting, Angela, kind of like that is a sign of self-reflection, but these are about like things that she experiences or feels. So she becomes aware, she can't bear it. She made to feel like these are no longer those kind of like active, powerful verbs, right? Where she's the subject who's doing. Instead, she is kind of like, she's acted upon in a way, but there is that element of her own self-reflection as something that she is still doing, which I think is important. But so the reason I ask about the verbs in a way is to kind of like, you can get to these much larger conclusions, right? About like activity and passivity, for example, about the stakes of self-reflection, right? About the way in which like blocking yourself off from something can be a thing to help yourself in a way, right? Because of this pain that you mentioned. Like you can get to those larger conclusions from those specificities, right? Like that's how you know that this stuff is kind of there in a way, right? Because the language of the text is like what's leading us to make those conclusions. So that's what the close reading that I'm talking about. This is an example of it in action. Yeah. So I mean, we could talk a lot more about this passage. I always like to ask about the small excursions, which is like my favorite phrase in that passage. Like, and I get students to think about like, what kind of a word is excursion? Like, what's the connotation of that, et cetera? Like, it's very different from a big adventure, for example, right? It's sort of, so it's like a tourist verb or something like that. So there, I mean, we can, and the smallness, that the adjective there, like there's lots of things to say about that. There are many points that we can make about this passage. Ultimately, I think they would all help us to see both the appeal of a sort of mode of fantasy, like in your persecuted situation, to kind of like, you know, one way to sort of like respond is to move into sort of like reverie or fantasy, but then you see the cost of that, right? Because the cost is to go back to Joy's point, is to kind of be reminded of one's own exclusion, right? And not kind of like connectedness, yeah? And so the painfulness of that. So lots that we could say about this passage, but we'll move to the Kluger passage. I'm curious to see whether that's group 2. I'm curious to see whether group 2 did their assignment or not. So let's see how you did. So what kinds of sense of maybe we'll start with the home question there. So I was asking you guys to pay attention to like that kind of language around the word home, or kind of synonyms of it in the passage. What did that lead you all to think about?
I feel like one of the things we picked up was like the Snow White and the palace. And so
Yes.
kind of being who was the insider and who was the outsider, and like her drawing a parallel to that, to her own situation of like being in like a home, but it's not her house kind of thing.
Perfect, right? Which fits very much with her experience of like what Austria turned out to be, right? For her nation, her country. Good. So there's the palace, right? Yeah. What other kinds of like homes or home-like spaces are being referenced here?
I'm not from that group, but can I jump in?
Sure can.
I know when I was looking at it, I noticed the house when it was talking about the theater being empty,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
she did feel like, you know, her enemy was still right there, so she doesn't feel safe in the house, the theater.
Yeah. Very, very good. And who's her enemy? It's like the neighbor's, right? It's the neighbor's kid, right? You know what I mean? Like, so like it's connected to where she's actually like living. But I think, and I mentioned before, I think that Nechama Tech wrote in English. Ruth Kluger wrote this in English too. She wrote the book originally in German, and then a few years later, she for 2001, she rewrote it in German. So it's not a translated book. It's actually really interesting. And if you compare the German and the English editions, they're not quite the same. So all which to say is this point about the house, like this is very like, you know, it's an idiomatic term to talk of a theater's house. It's not like crazy or weird, but I think that there's also seems so importantly evoking this kind of like connection as to like even the space that seems like it is not a domestic space, right? It's a public space, you know, especially in this era, movies are like the most powerful mass entertainment form, right? Where the whole point is that like everybody's getting together, and these places were gigantic too. Even that is described in terms of this language, as you point out, right? Of like also something kind of domestic or connected. Yeah. So ways in which like, you know, whether it's the palace in the fairy tale, whether it's the theater that she goes to, whether it's the fact that her enemy is someone who like she actually intimately knows, right? I think that is important. It tells us something about like this problem of feeling that like you are been shunted away or jettisoned from the place that you thought you belonged to. It also incidentally tells us something about like a truth about the experience of the Holocaust for its victims, namely that like the persecution that they faced was typically very intimate. Like there's a kind of like cliche or stereotype of the Nazi efficiency and the clinical precision and the like industrial conveyor belt quality of like a place like Auschwitz, et cetera, et cetera. But like the historical reality is like is not like that. Like even Auschwitz was an incredibly chaotic, messy place that ran on pretty primitive technology, and that the overwhelming number of people who were murdered or otherwise physically punished, like that happened to them at close range, right? And so like, and often from people who they might have known, you know, like people who had lived in their town or something like that. So the intimacy of violence and of persecution, I think, is another kind of like sideline thing that we might note here. What about the idea of self-awareness? How does that kind of play out in this passage? Is Kelly the only person allowed to talk in group 2, or does someone else get stuck?
No, she was good. We talked a lot about, we did it, promise. But we talked a lot about like how like almost hyper aware she was about her Jewishness, like very much aware of who she was and the laws that were prohibiting her for doing the thing that she wanted to do, but she was going to do it anyway. So it was like this acknowledging of defying the law, and then unfortunately feeling the shame for being found out, because she was really hoping that she wouldn't be.
Yeah, right. I mean, and thank you. That's really well said, JC. I think that like the terrible irony, I mean, the fact that like the persecution that's happening, it's all legal, right? Like, so like she's the one breaking laws, right? Like these laws are perverse laws, these laws are racist laws, etc., but they're laws, right? And you know, one of the things that Kluger tells us about in her memoir, and this kind of anticipating some things I'll say towards the end of the presentation here, is that like she'll allude to her own experiences when she came to America after the war, and she goes from New York to Los Angeles, and she takes the bus, the Greyhound, and she's going across the South, and it's 1950, and she's seeing all the signs of segregation, and they're like the way they're kind of like they strike her, the kind of similarity to her own experience. And it is historically true. And again, this is something that like I don't think enough Americans know, that like the Nuremberg laws, the race laws that defined who was quote unquote Aryan and who was Jewish, those laws were explicitly based on American Jim Crow and Indian, so-called Indian law, right? And the Nazis, after they came to power in 1933, sent jurists across the American South to go to law school in the American South to study this particular law. There's a guy who came to Arkansas, which is where I live, and studied for a year at the law school at Fayetteville, for example, and that was true in pretty much all Southern American states. There was someone like that. So there is like a totally intimate connection there between American experience and the experience of German fascism, but it's connected to this idea of like she's the rule breaker, right? Just for existing. Yeah. So this legality of the persecution, right? Her attempt to kind of like hide in plain sight, right? And she has this plan that like if she kind of like gets the best seats, then that will help her pass, right? And then her passing is kind of undone, right? Just as in some ways Tech's attempt to pass, like to kind of fit in, to try to pretend to be one of those happy, carefree schoolgirls, fails, right? She's found out, not found out by them. She's found out sort of by herself, as we heard a minute ago, right? But she is found out, and that's the same thing is happening to Kluger as well. I'll just note one more thing about the passage, that in terms of the language, if you look at like I'm always struck with this passage about the language that like of all these nouns or verbs that begin with the prefix ex of x, like expelled, exposed, excluded me at the very end. This is all at the very end of the passage, right? Not different, same prefix that's in excursion, by the way, right? And that very prefix, I mean, if you want to kind of do this sort of work with your students, like you can have them look up what that prefix means, right? You know, and like the way it has that a sense of like kind of like you know, of escape, of attempt to outside, right? Attempt to get outside a situation. This desire is like baked into the very language that's being used. And it's precisely this desire that is like foiled here, right? With grave consequences. It hurts. It's a very dangerous situation for her, right? Though a situation that leads to some self-knowledge, okay? So finally, if we look for the last passage with Kaufman, and this is the one where I cheat a little bit because this is a text that was not written in English. It was written in French. It's translated. So doing the close reading with it is a little bit sketchy, but I think it's okay. So what did group 3 have to say in response to the questions that I asked you all? It's just like my classes. It's just an overwhelming cascade of answers. It's cacophony. I don't even know where to start.
Again.
I could.
Go
I
ahead.
think, Tim, you want to go? What do you want to do?
You go ahead, Mary Jo.
Sure. So what we concluded from this, as far as self-awareness, there seemed to be more of almost like a disassociation with this child, almost that she couldn't bear what was happening, so she didn't want to feel these things. So we would almost interpret that she didn't have that self-awareness because she chose not to, because it was too painful.
Right. And how do you see that choosing happening in the passage?
Well, we talked about detaching from her, so she's
Yeah.
almost like she's detaching from herself in a way as a survival. She speaks about her mother's suffering, but doesn't speak about her own suffering.
That's a nice
Really,
point. Yeah.
yeah, she doesn't really, she speaks about, I think, her father and her brother, but there's no emotional words associated with them not being present. So it's just sort of making note of it, but we don't pick up any kind of emotion that she might be feeling during this.
Yeah, the emotion is displaced there, right, onto the mother. My mother
Yes.
suffered in silence, right? So like there's an emotional term there, suffering, but yeah, you're right. It's not like hers, right? You know? Yeah. Good. Buried the entire past. So that word burying might speak to your point here of kind
Yeah.
of like, yeah, disassociating or splitting herself or kind of hiding in some fashion, right? So this fits with this rhetoric of hiding, but yet being seen that we see in the other passages too, because I think there is a kind of countervailing tendency of something that is seen too. Like, how does the whole business with her nose work in this passage?
Yeah. We were saying the same thing, similar to one of the previous passages where these things, she's very aware of what is happening to her and what is being said to her, like about her nose or the Jewish nose, or this is
Yep.
happening to her mother's nose. So there's a lot of repetition about just that part of it. Again, a very external feature that is part of her.
Yep.
So that's all the first paragraph is, how this detachment even came to be and what the nose is even symbolic of. All tangibles, all very obvious. And then the second paragraph is really just focusing, it's almost like in hindsight, she applies the meaning and the self-awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a split there between like kind of Kaufman as a kid, right? Young Kaufman, 8-year-old Kaufman, whatever. 9 years old, I guess, so at the time. And 50-year-old Kaufman. I can't remember how old she was when she wrote this, but yeah, yes, definitely, right? And the way in which like it seems so painful to me. And it is a very kind of, in some ways, sort of painful text. And like students are often able to see the ways in which like, going back to an earlier point, I think that Joy made about like connections that you can make outside this situation to like kind of victimizer victim kind of like relationships, right? Like the way in which it is that the abuser, the victimizer, the perpetrator, if you will, if you want to go that far, is the person who like tells the person who's abused like what they are ostensibly. Do you know what I mean? Like where she's like, here, feel the nose, right? Feel your nose. She's like, she makes Kaufman like legible to herself in some way, right? So and this is, if you want to connect to the Holocaust, it is also true that like the perpetrators, the Nazis, were the ones who are defining terms, right? Like there's plenty of victims of Jewish victims who thought of themselves as Jewish, absolutely. But there were also victims who didn't necessarily think of themselves as Jewish, right? Like perhaps they had converted or like their parents had converted, but the race laws are like, if one of your grandparents was Jewish, then you're Jewish too. So then so it's the oppressor who's kind of like setting the terms for identity here in a way, right? And I always take that like moment of like, look here, feel your nose to be a bit analogous to this, even though Meme is not a perpetrator in the same way. Like she's not a Nazi or anything like. She's in fact saving Kaufman's life, right? But this is kind of the poignancy of the moment, right? Is that she is also harming her, right? And so I think and the kind of play in the figurative nose in the first paragraph, right under my mother's nose, and the literal nose is something that the passage is kind of like is interested in with as well, right? The weird way in which she has like fallen in love with the woman who turns her against herself, right? Her later ability to acknowledge how hard this must have been, but she couldn't acknowledge that at the time, right? So Mei teaches Kaufman to hate her own body, to hate her own identity, to take on another one by making her experience herself as others do. And that's something I think is really kind of like significant about what's going on in this passage. I often like to ask students about the stuff that's towards the end of the first paragraph there, the things that Mei said. Jewish food is bad for the health. The Jews crucified our savior. They're stingy. They're so smart. They don't have, no one has made geniuses. So I like to ask why Kaufman presents that in a single kind of like utterance, right? Like, I think the point is, like, it seems highly unlikely that Mei said that all at the same time, right? These are these kind of things she would say over and over again. And yet that is not the way that Kaufman chooses to portray them. She chooses to portray them as dialogue that's in quotations. All is this kind of very sophisticated long sentence, syntactically complex sentence with all the semicolons and stuff. So what does that do, right? Like, what's that choice all about? Angela, you look like you had a thought about that maybe?
Yeah, because I was thinking, and one of the things we talked about was the idea of a child being, as she uses the word, transforming. So
Yep.
easily malleable, shapeable, moldable. And this is happening, if you can turn someone against themselves and their own identity and detach them from their very mother, then we sort of have a better understanding of something like the Hitler youth camps and how easy it is to take this conditioning and these little tiny phrases. And when you compile them and put them all together, we recognize the bigger message to transform a child into either the self-loathing or the loathing of another person based on, their
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. And I just want to add one thing about that before we move on to the last thing I want to do today, which is that, like, we shouldn't just think of those kinds of moments as like indoctrination or like brainwashing or something. We have to always remember what is being gained, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like all the kids in the Hitler Youth or the Bund Deutscher Mädel or whatever, like Kaufman here, they're like, who's also kind of being brainwashed. Like, they're not just like in bad faith or something. They're not just like fools or idiots, but they're also clearly getting something out of that, right? Like some kind of sense. And so this is part of the dissociation is so powerful here, to go back to the initial term, because like it's what gains her the ability to thrive in the situation, right? It's a really perverse thriving, because it sort of like means she has to hurt her mother and kind of hurt herself in a way, but we shouldn't just dismiss that too quickly. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like that there's always some kind of gain, right? And if you don't think about that, then it sort of seems like, oh, all those people just shouldn't have been so stupid or whatever. But, like they shouldn't have joined the Hitler Youth or something like that, right? But like what, think about what kind of like sense of community is being gained, right? And so what makes a good community, a sustaining community versus a harmful community, right, is always a question to be thinking about with our students. So, okay, we could say even more about these passages, and I think hopefully you can see that like a short excerpt you can do a lot of work, especially if you kind of just hold your students to the fire a little and just like make them spend time with the thing, and like really kind of drill down in specifics of language. I think that's where we are able then to get the kind of like most wide-ranging conclusions. So we see in all these figures that there's like weird intertwining between like resistance, like there's resistance that's happening on the part of these writers, and that takes the form of self-knowledge, but the self-knowledge always comes at the cost of so much pain, right? And that's where then I always bring in the passage from W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of double consciousness, right? And he's writing in a really different context. He's writing in 1903, he's writing about Blacks in America, African American community, and the way in which like the kind of like painful problem that African Americans experience is that they always have to like look at the world through, in his language, through the tape, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. This means you're always split or doubled. Like you can't just like look at yourself in terms of yourself. You always have to do so in terms that the dominant culture, the majority, the more powerful culture has set, right? So his term for that is double consciousness. And I always explain this to my, the double consciousness is the result of like when we have to define ourselves through the eyes of others. And so I always talk about this with students in kind of a low stakes way, sort of a silly way, but like, because I am Canadian originally, right? And so like Canadians actually spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be Canadian in a way that I have found Americans do not spend a lot of time thinking about, which is pretty telling, right? And so when Canadians are doing their thing that they're always doing about like, so who are we anyways? The first thing that Canadians will say is like, okay, well, we're not Americans. Right? And so like, and the reason for that is that, and again, Americans don't say, what is to be American? Well, we're not Canadians. Like that, I 100% guarantee you, like never happens, right? Like you're like, who are you cute little people to the north? Like, you know, like it's this weird, we're not important. We do not register, right? You know what I mean? But, you know, the America is kind of like a cultural dominant in a way, right? You know, like in geopolitical terms, in cultural terms, there's that sort of sense of domination, right? So that like the Canadians are like you thinking of themselves in terms of these terms that are set by another, right? So this is like kind of a silly example, but what Du Bois is saying is that like minorities have to they're forced to define themselves in terms that are set by the majority. Okay. And so this always means a kind of like loss, right? Like there's always this alienation. There's always this problem of like, you know, just like what Mei is doing. Hey, look how Jewish you are, right? Okay. But there's something else that comes with it because that position has to be a critical position, right? Maybe she wasn't able to do it at 8 years old, but she certainly could do it then later on, right? And I think we see in the Chama text how she's already kind of doing it in ways that we discussed, right? Ruth Kluger, elsewhere in her memoir, she says like, you know, she learned to read from reading the posters in the street in Vienna, and the posters were the slogans, they were all anti-Semitic. That's what she learned to read. And she said, it gave me an early opportunity to practice critical discrimination. So that's the kind of ironic mode that she like, you know, that sort of fits her character, right? But like she's really onto something there, right? You know what I mean? Because like the minority always has to know more than the majority, right? The majority, the cultural dominant, is kind of stupid in a way, right? They don't need to they don't have to ever translate their own experience into anyone else's terms. This is kind of like the definition of privilege, right? Like where you can just go through the world and everything is like made for you, right? When you have to interpret yourself through terms that someone else has given you, then that's what Du Bois is kind of, how does it mean to be a problem? It's not a problem for him. It's a problem because other people are making it a problem, right? You know what I mean? And it's because of that imbalance in power, you know? So there's a real paradox here because on the one hand, you are totally losing something, right? Like your sense of self has to come from someone else's sense of self. But you are also gaining something, namely you're gaining that critical discernment, you're gaining that like that the gap between those things allows you to see more, right? It's a really precarious, dangerous position. Psychologically, thus the dissociation, for example, or in the tech passage where she's like, I had to stop doing this. I had to stop hurting myself by looking over at these kids because it was killing me, right? You know what I mean? Like it's psychologically damaging. And in the Du Bois passage, I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm not going through it closely here, but it's on your handout. Like he talks about how like you feel it, the African American feels this in their body, like it's always at risk of being split asunder. And he's definitely got, you know, the language there of like of lynchings and of other forms of violence are absolutely, you know, should be echoing for us there, right? You know, so physical and psychological kind of like risk, right? Like, you know, this idea that I think has been popularized much more recently, right? The body keeps the score, you know, like the sense that like the microaggressions, the kind of like traumas that one are facing, like those psychological things, they have physiological effects too, right? I think we're much more cognizant of such things now, but like the sense of like, it's not easy to be in the minority position. That said, it's not just to be victimized all the time because there's this sort of like possibility of like the double consciousness, you know, the sort of like the the critical self-knowledge, for example, right? So, couple last things to say. if I like to bring this Du Bois in because it lets students to think alongside the Holocaust survivors, because I think it can let students of a lot of different ages and experiences, if you help them with this concept, to think intersectionally, which I think is really important for all of us to be able to do, right? To think about how this one scenario and this other scenario, they're not the same scenarios, but they can inform each other, right? Okay. And we can see how minority experiences are more similar than different, even though we're not saying they're identical. We're not trying to judge like which is worse, slavery or the Holocaust. Like that's just gross and unhelpful. Like that's not the point. But like trying to think about what different modes of experience can kind of like bring to when you juxtapose them, what new things you can say, right? And then also, as I alluded to at the beginning, like especially for American students, and I'm in the South, and maybe it's different for you all, well, although I kind of doubt it, like the sense of like, if you can bring in something like Du Bois, you are able to go back to Joy's point from a long time ago about like how you can make them understand something in relation to their own lives or own experience in some way, right? You know what I mean? So whether, if people are members of a minority, well, they can be asking themselves, like, can we harness the power of double consciousness and not be crushed by it, right? And if they're members of a majority, they can ask themselves, can we become self-aware enough not to harm those who are not in the majority, right? And people are going to be in majorities, minorities in different kinds of ways, depending on which situation they're in. So those lessons are probably applicable pretty wide-rangingly to a lot of our students. So I feel like one of the things you can do here with a lesson like this is you can get to some really big conclusions, but your big conclusions are always going to have been grounded by the fact that you like put some pieces of the text at the center, right? And if you have the time, luxury in your class, in your syllabus to like assign a whole memoir, wonderful, right? And then a whole memoir and then 2 little short excerpts. But, lots of times we don't have that kind of luxury. And I think you can do a lot of work even with short excerpts, depending on the work of contextualizing that you do. And in some ways that has an advantage in as much as like you just have to force your students to like really pay attention to a small set of text, and like, you know what I mean? Like there's just nowhere else for them to go. Like there's only this paragraph. We really have to bear down on it. And that can often bring out some really useful things, as I think our short, our too short, too abbreviated conversations also kind of suggested. So that's what I wanted to present to you all today. I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to, I want to know what questions that you have about any of the stuff that I've been trying to work through together with you today.
I have a question. How receptive are the students that you have when you do lessons like this?
Sorry, say that again.
How receptive are the students? Is there a lot of conversation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think students are really interested in they're interested in the connections, like kind of just historically, I think. But I think that the idea of thinking about like how precarious the experience of being a minority is, but that precariousness involves the things that are kind of like enabling and powerful, as well as things that are sort of disabling and really scary and risky. Like I think that's really that always seems to be of great interest to them. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Like, it's not like every time I teach something it goes great or whatever, but like, but I think this kind of like the setup allows us to sort of get to some things that are like of big import. But not just by like having kind of just started with a huge claim that we can't really support or something. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else have any questions, observations? You can just jump in. No, everybody's okay. All right. If there are,
I refuse to believe it. Surely there are other like questions that you have. What are the kinds of students that you all are teaching or hoping to teach? Are they like, what age range are they?
I
teach fourth grade.
Oh wow, yeah. And
So
I'm always really like, I know we just instituted mandatory Holocaust education in public schools in Arkansas, and I know that New Jersey is like, I don't know if you all are actually in New Jersey, but New Jersey is like a leader in this. You've done it for such a long time and everything, so you guys are kind of like the standard, I think. But so if you're here, it's starting with fifth grade and up. And I don't know how that works for you all, but like the question of what to do with younger kids, I think is one that I always find really personally kind of like something to struggle with, right? You know what I mean? Like at sort of what is the right age just for something to start? Yeah.
I think
Dorian.
the Holocaust Museum recommends sixth grade and up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Joy, I
Yeah.
hate to throw you under the bus here, but
Sure.
did any of the readings, are there any of the 3 passages that you feel you could use in your classroom?
The one I got assigned, the first group, the first passage, I do feel like I could use. And as I mentioned, it related to something I did over the summer
Yeah.
at the Smithsonian, where you're using art to strike up conversation. So I have a piece in mind that passage would pair really well with, and then it would go to that education on, isolating others and how we make people feel, unincluded based on their differences, and how we have to work on not doing that. So it would be more the character ed. So I think the first piece would lend itself well, and I could tie in the art, and the word Holocaust would not come out of my mouth, but it would just be more on how people sometimes feel that we don't recognize how they feel.
Right.
And we're not, just like in the passage, the other children were ignorant to what was going on in the world. I wouldn't focus on that, but I would focus more on, we might be closed off to recognizing how others are feeling, and exclusivity versus inclusivity, and that sort of thing.
Right. And I don't know whether it's possible to kind of bring out that sense in which she has gained something in her ability to be the one who knows more than the others do. And there is a kind of solace there, I think. Like, so maybe, you know what I mean? Like when you're excluded, it sucks, but like there is a kind of solace there, but it's like, it's also sucks. Right. I mean, like, so like kind of like to kind of keep that duality.
So, yeah, and I would really bring it down on the elementary level. I had a class one year that we donated a buddy bench to the playground. So then I would take them outside to the buddy bench, tie in, what it is and the purpose of it. So I would definitely keep it on my 9 and 10-year-old level, but I think that passage could be used.
In
that way.
Yeah, that's exciting to hear, because I know that's a super big challenge that you have to sort of like work with material like this for young ages. Yeah.
Tim?
There is a great book written by an author named Lauren Grodstein, Grodstein. The name of the book is We Must Not Think of Ourselves. It's a wonderful book. It's a novel. It's fiction, but it is about the Holocaust, and the ghetto and the ghettos. It is just beyond. So Google it, check it, and see. Again, We Must Not Think of Ourselves, and the author is Lauren Grodstein. And just to say, I have no connection with her, so if you buy her book, I get no royalty.
No kickback.
Thank you.
All right, disinterested. I appreciate the recognition, or the reference. Thanks. Yeah, there's another hand there too.
Tim?
Yeah, just at the beginning of this, you had mentioned that you could do this regardless of the amount of time you spend on the Holocaust. Just when you would do this lesson, how much background would your students normally have?
Right. So I do teach classes that are like really centered. They're all about the Holocaust, right? So I mean, I have one class that's Holocaust literature and film, and then I have another class that is about like sort of a little more of this intersectional stuff about like thinking about the afterlife of the Holocaust in relation to other experiences as well. So my students like would know like a lot, but like when I taught it at that conference for the middle school and the high schoolers, they had like none basically, especially because that was before the mandated Holocaust law here. And so like some students at some schools might have gotten something, but most would have had nothing. So it's always very challenging when you have no other, like if you just have one day or some ridiculous thing like that, like it is so hard to do that. I mean, because the context is so actually really complicated, right? And the received view that we have of it in the United States, we think of like the cattle cars, the barbed wire, the dogs, Auschwitz, is a part of the story, but by no means the whole story. And so there's a lot of work to be done to kind of challenge that stuff. But I also think that like if you had just a few days to kind of like, look, we're going to just work with these passages. I'm going to tell you about the people who wrote this. I'm going to tell you about where this happened, and I'll tell you a teensy bit about when this happened. I have a hunch that, again, based on that experience at the conference, that like the specificity can actually do a lot more than like, I'm going to try and give you like a 1 hour like lecture about the whole Holocaust or something like that. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. I'm curious. What do you think?
I love the samples and the examples that they can provide for students when you're trying to make connections to things in history. I love just like the way they're very, I think, especially that first one, I feel like is adaptable to so many different age groups. So I definitely think they could be. I'm just curious, in your experience, having done this before, how much, if it's had a role in students' ability to understand it, if they've had more or less exposure to it previously.
Well, for sure, the more they know, the more helpful that is. But I mean, again, I don't know how much experience you all have. Like, I feel like that's probably really varying, right? And so, like, some of you may know a lot, and some of you may know only kind of, whatever, a medium amount or stuff. And I feel like you were able to do a lot of work with it, right? Despite that. So, I mean, as far as I know, no one here is taking like, these are not like classes designed to help you teach the Holocaust, right? Like, is that what you're all trying to do all the time? Like,
That's what they are, yeah.
but you don't just teach that, is my point, right? Like you teach a lot of other things, or you just teach the Holocaust.
We're all varying teachers. Like I'm a high school social studies teacher, so classes I typically teach aren't specific to the Holocaust. No.
Right. Okay. That was my hunch, right? I mean, so like, but nonetheless, you were able to do a lot, right? And I think that giving students something to do, like, again, like this particular activity where they have to kind of like work with something, and I've done other things with like using bits from diaries, like the same week of like I choose a week in June 1942 because that's the week Anne Frank started her diary, and everyone knows Anne Frank. So, but like we look at like a bunch of diarists in different parts of Europe at the same time, just little snippets from that week, or with photographs. Like if you have just sort of like these texts are kind of like, they're pretty modest in size, like giving people things to do with them, to pay attention to them. I think that activity really is important, right? Because it just makes them learn better, right? I mean, like it sort of builds in I don't know. I think the term of art we're supposed to use now, and you probably all know this better than I, like high impact learning practices, right? Like, I mean, those are like more high impact practices because they're like doing something. So I would encourage you to like, that's almost more important, I feel like, than how much kind of context you can give them. I mean, you do need to give them some, I think, but like, I think it can also be okay with a small amount of context if you're guiding them carefully through the active doing of something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this is that's what these classes that we're taking right now are for. It's to try and help us figure out how we can incorporate it when we aren't specific Holocaust teachers.
This is so great that you have this. I just have to say, like, you guys are really lucky, because I know the Arkansas teachers, I work a lot with various groups of Arkansas teachers right now. They basically just got this mandate, like, now you have to start doing this. And that was basically all they got. And so like, they're really scrambling, they're really stressing, because they're like, wow, it's not like they don't want to do it, but they're like, someone please help us, you know what I mean? And so this is wonderful that you have this, you having this professional development here. It's like really, really admirable. So I salute you.
All right. Anybody else before we get ready to sign out? All right. Well, Dr. Stuber, we're very happy that you were able to join us today. Thank you so much for giving us this different perspective on how to address this very complex topic in our classrooms. Like Tim pointed out, we're very limited in time, so trying to find ways to do this is very, very helpful. So we appreciate you joining us today. And I'm sure that we've learned a lot and we'll be able to use some of your techniques in our classrooms. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm reachable at Hendrix really easily, Stuber at hendrix.edu. You can find me on Hendrix website. I'm on Twitter, or whatever we're supposed to call it now, all the time. So please feel free to reach out. Always happy to chat or share things. If it's helpful you to have the slides or anything like that, happy to do that. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a great one, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.